and I'm the Communications Director at Environmental Forum of Marin. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event called Healthy Soils, Growing Climate Resilience. When we talk about preventing the worst of climate change, we talk about two different challenges. First, we've got to reduce emissions. And second, we have to draw down out of the atmosphere the excess carbon we've already emitted, which is about 1,000 gigatons of it. So everybody has ideas for reducing emissions. It's pretty straightforward, like drive less. But though the concepts are easy, it is of course not so easy to implement. But many of us frankly have no idea how we can actually do the second part, which is pull carbon dioxide out of the air. There are new cutting edge technologies being developed, but the most powerful and the only proven way to draw down CO2 is as old as dirt. Regenerative agriculture. It's a powerful tool for drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's just one of its many benefits. It would dramatically enhance the quality of the foods we eat, the water we drink, and the web of wildlife all around us. It's a ray of positivity in the darkness of the climate crisis, and that's why we're so excited to share this event with you tonight. So here's the agenda for the evening. Tonight, you'll be hearing from 3 experts, 4 when you include our moderator, who will help to build your understanding of the tremendous potential of regenerative agriculture to address multiple climate and ecological issues. I'm going to introduce each speaker separately, but I wanted to begin by thanking them all for taking the time to speak to us tonight. I also want to thank 2 of EFM's former board members, Helene Marsh and Sarah Lohren, who originally put this entire program together, selecting these speakers and structuring the whole event. And finally, a shout out to our sponsors who've provided financial support for this program. The Agricultural Institute of Marin, often referred to as AIM, Drawdown Marin, Marin Agricultural Land Trust, better known as MALT, OFA Marin, Sierra Club Marin County Group, Strauss Family Creamery, and 350 Marin. At the end of this program, we'll let you know how you can support the work of each of these terrific organizations. So now, to get everyone on the same page with a basic understanding of the relationship between carbon dioxide and agriculture, we're going to show a 4-minute video narrated by Michael Pollan, filmed mostly in Marin, and produced by our moderator, Diana Donlan.
95% of what we eat. Yet, we take it for granted. Thousands of years of plowing, deforestation, and erosion have left our soils in dire shape. And we're accelerating the loss of this essential resource. But there's a lot more to the story. When soil is damaged, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this has had serious consequences for the climate. Too much carbon in the atmosphere is causing the Earth to overheat. That excess carbon is also acidifying our oceans, threatening marine life. Meanwhile, there's not enough carbon where it once was, in the soil. In fact, many of the world's cultivated soils have lost more than 50% of their original carbon stocks. But there's actually some good news. We now know how to put carbon back in the soil where it belongs. Plants capture carbon dioxide in their leaves and pump the carbon down through their roots to feed hungry microorganisms living in the soil. Now, what had been atmospheric carbon, a problem, becomes soil carbon, a solution. Practices like keeping soil covered with plants, increasing crop diversity, composting, and carefully planned grazing are proven ways to put carbon back into the soil. Carbon-rich soils act like giant sponges, absorbing water during floods and providing it to plants in times of drought. And adding carbon to soil makes the land much more productive. The French government recognizes this and is calling on all countries to join them in increasing soil carbon by 0.4% each year. If every nation were to reach this ambitious but achievable goal, we could store 75% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions, enough to make a real difference to our planet's future well-being. Of course, we still need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, but we don't need to develop expensive or risky technologies. Instead, what we need is a lot more photosynthesis. Climate change can be overwhelming, yet there is real hope. Healthy soil can be a major sink for carbon. But this fact hasn't been well known until now. Because now we know a soil solution is right beneath our feet.
I just
Click on.
quick video. I think it's terrific. It's a great introduction, quick explanation of how soil carbon is a climate solution. So our first speaker tonight is Renata Brillinger, who is the co-founder and executive director of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, CalCAN. CalCAN is a statewide coalition that advances state and federal policy so that we can expand the amount of sustainable and organic agriculture here in California. Renata, we're really glad to have you here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Anne-Christine, and thanks to your whole team for pulling this together. And also thanks to Diana Donlan, who's moderating tonight and is one of the producer of that little video. So we're lucky to have her on board here too. And welcome to my home in in Sebastopol. A little caveat: there's possible you'll catch a glimpse of my dog or one of my cats or my teenager. So you'll be lucky if you get to see that. It's a fun time we're living in where we get to drop into each other's homes virtually. So I am going to share a little bit about CalCAN's work and about basically the sort of state of play at the moment in California around climate and agriculture policy. There's a lot to say, but I'm just going to try to give you a really high level overview of where we've been and where we're going in about 20 minutes or so. So first, just a quick word about CalCAN to kind of ground you in sort of our piece of the story. We're a coalition of sustainable and organic agriculture organizations. We work on behalf of farmers and we work in close collaboration with farmers as advisors and models and spokespeople, advocates. And our the work that we do is to drive policy change in order to achieve a transformation in agriculture. We think that changing the rules, changing the economic indicators that form the basis of farmers' decisions will yield solutions on the scale that we need to address this climate crisis that is increasingly apparent. We rely heavily on science to figure out which way we should point to those economic indicators. We work very closely with a lot of different individual farmers and ranchers and with a lot of organizations around the state in coalition and in collaboration and with a lot of advisors that really help guide the work. We're very farmer-centered. That's who we're accountable to in the end, and that's what informs the work that we do. And we're really focused on incentives. Our experience has been that farmers and most people respond well to incentives, especially if they're incentives that yield a whole bunch of benefits for that individual or that business. And we really try to seek solutions that have multiple benefits to them. And because we think it's important to address equity, and because we think that the folks at this sort of smaller scale, farmers of color, women farmers, organic farmers, the system is really challenging, rigged against those kind of growers. So we are really prioritizing their needs and lifting up their voices in our work. So I was asked to just quickly address some of the problems in facing agriculture, and I don't want to dwell too long on this, but I'll just quickly, cover a little bit of this. I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the issues in agriculture. We are seeing it's just increasingly challenging to grow food in California, what with droughts and water scarcity. As climate changes, we'll see more and more pest pressures and disease and weed pressures. There's a tremendous amount of variability. I talked to a lot of farmers, even farmers who have been farming for decades, who are really flummoxed to figure out. The history is no indicator any longer for helping them make their decisions about when to plant or what to plant. Greenhouse gas emissions are certainly a part of farming, as are most human activities. So this is an issue that agriculture has to grapple with, is how to comply with or be part of the state's solutions around reducing emissions. Agriculture is a contributor to a lot of water and air quality problems that have community health impacts. We have to be thoughtful about how to protect and safeguard and ensure the safety of our farm workers, on who we depend for the food we eat. And that's never been more apparent than it has been during the pandemic, just revealing the dependence we have on those essential workers and the challenging conditions under which they live and work that are putting us all at risk, essentially. We're facing a really big loss of productive farmland. It's been going on for a few decades, and it's continuing to limit our ability to produce enough food for ourselves and the rest of the country. And so we're seeing, a lot of urban sprawl and encroachment on that really productive farmland, some of the most productive in the world. And as farmers age out, we have a challenge about bringing new farmers in, especially with the cost of land here in the state. So as we think about all these problems, at CalCAN at least, and with many of our partners, we're looking for solutions that solve as many of these as possible at once. I often am inspired by the thoughts and experience and poetry and writing of Wendell Berry. And several decades ago, I think in the 76 or something, he wrote an essay that's just as good to read today as it was then, called Solving for Pattern. And he talks at length about how important it is, when we are trying to make things right, that we solve for a whole bunch of things at the same time. And we have to make sure we're solving the right problem, and we have to make sure that we're not making things worse or inadvertently creating new problems in our attempts to solve what we're facing. So these are some of the principles that guide our thoughts about how to constructively bring agriculture into the climate policy arena, so they can deliver positive solutions. So some of those solutions, and this is going to be a pretty high level overview because I'm going to want to hone in on healthy soil specifically, but some of them are, there's a lot of things farmers can do to help achieve California's mandate of getting to net carbon neutrality by 2045. Renewable energy, reduction of fuel use, reducing nitrogen fertilizer use. Nitrogen is a big greenhouse gas when it metabolizes into nitrous oxide. Preventing farmland development, because when we sprawl out from our cities, when we do sprawl development, we end up with a much more energy intensive, carbon intensive footprint. So if we can keep that farmland in farming, we'll not only be able to produce more food, but we'll limit and avoid future emissions increases. Livestock produce a lot of methane from their waste and from their gases. So this is a big area of research and programmatic incentives. And then, as Anne-Christine said, this very powerful and unique solution that agriculture has of storing carbon in soil and plants. And Jeff and Cindy will both be talking some more about the science behind this. So I'm going to just keep moving on here and start talking, giving you an orientation to the programs that California has set up that provide grants for farmers for delivering these community benefits. California is blazing quite a trail in this way. As far as I know, there's no other country, well, we're not even a country, although we are economically the size of one, but there's no other jurisdiction in the world that's doing, as far as I know, this sort of suite of comprehensive programs to bring agriculture into the climate space as a solution center. So we've got 4 programs that have been stood up in the last 5 or 6 years that do various things, over $400 million invested in 1,600 or more specific projects and 1.2 million metric tons of CO2 emissions reduced. So high level overview of all these, you're welcome to go into our website and dive in more deeply. But one of them is a Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program that gives grants for permanently protecting agricultural land that would otherwise be at risk of development. And the premise here is that urban land emits roughly 70 times more greenhouse gas emissions than a given acre of irrigated farmland. So by limiting that sprawl, we get these avoided emissions down the road through keeping our transportation and our energy, our footprint smaller. Below that, the SWEEP programs. This is a program that incentivizes farmers to install more energy efficient irrigation, things like solar pumps, improved diesel pumps, soil moisture monitoring, soil health improvements, in fact. And then another program, the Healthy Soils Program, which I'll talk some more about in a minute. So I'll come back to that. And then the 4th one is the Alternative Manure Management Program, or AMP. And this one gives grants to farmers for improving their manure management strategies so that the manure is dry and not liquidated, and then creating anaerobic conditions that produce the methane that causes greenhouse gas, or that causes climate change. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. So this program gives grants to farmers to improve and modernize their equipment so that they can scrape the manure out instead of flushing it, and then turn it into compost, which is a very important soil fertility product. So those are the 4 programs here. They're overlaid with a technical assistance program that I'm not going to talk much about, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle because a lot of farmers, especially the smaller farmers or farmers of color, need that kind of technical assistance in order to successfully apply for these grant programs and then implement the projects and deal with all the paperwork. So that's sort of connected to all of these. So I'm going to very quickly just flash up this image for you. These programs have been in existence for various amounts of time, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And they've grown steadily. You can see just by glancing at these that the demand for the programs has increased each year, not linearly, but that's the general trend. And that the demand, the amount that's requested, has almost in every grant cycle has exceeded, in some cases far exceeded, the amount of money available. So this is a real indicator of how popular the programs are becoming and how much momentum is being built, for them. And I don't have, unfortunately, a happy ending to this story just yet, but I'll get to that in a second. We've seen an interruption in the funding just as they were becoming more well-known and more in more demand. So I have, in my many conversations with farmers, I think there's a bunch of things going on that account for this this trend line of increasing interest in the programs. I mean, one of the things is just that the word's getting out, and farmers, like any other people, tend to learn from each other and kind of hear about experiences and find out that way, that there's these opportunities. But there's a few other things I think that make these programs attractive to a farmer. So, obviously California at large and the planet generally is going to benefit from any reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or any carbon stored. But for the farmer who's a business person, they have to be thinking first and foremost about how to stay in business. And so the good news is that a lot of these practices that are rewarded through these grant programs deliver these tremendous benefits for farmers as business people. In some cases, they help them modernize or upgrade their equipment. They can improve their operational efficiency. They can decrease the costs of certain inputs like chemicals or labor or water or energy. In some cases, it helps farmers come into better compliance with the myriad regulatory burdens that they face. Because, as I alluded to, some of the practices not only benefit the climate, but they also improve air and water quality. Certainly with the Healthy Soils program or the AMP program, farmers can see increased yields because they're producing fertility on their farm, or they're bringing in inputs that increase their yields. They're generally speaking are healthier working conditions, not only for the farmer themselves, but for their labor force. And the farmers that we tend to work with, a lot of them work on, or rather live on or near the farm. Their interests are entangled, with how healthy their workplace is and how healthy their family is. And then there's a certain amount of clout. I think this is in part due to just increasing awareness and acceptance of the sort of downsides of farming, the environmental challenges of farming. There's a certain amount of credibility that comes with being a good steward and being able to demonstrate that. And I think many farmers want to be perceived and are in trying to be good stewards. So I think there's something intangible as well about participating in these programs. And then, you sort of see down on the list, I don't know that it's always the first thing that a lot of farmers and ranchers think about, but certainly for a lot of them, they are wanting to be good stewards and wanting to lead. So, but I think just from conversations, that is co-equal or even lower a priority than some of these other concerns and questions. And I think if I think about my own life, I have economic constraints, when I make my choices about how I'm going to spend my time or my money. So I think it's just very human to try to develop these programs in a way that really serve some of the basic economic and business interests of farmers. And I think these programs have done that. So I'm going to get into the healthy soils practices really briefly here. And I know that both Cindy and Jeff are going to, keep reiterating some of this. But the Healthy Soils program that's been launched here in California, 3 or 4 years old now, it gives grants for one or more of the practices, generally speaking, that are on this list here. It's a longer list. There's something like 26 or 7 practices currently. But it funds farmers to apply compost or mulch, to do cover cropping, which is a non-cash crop typically that gets planted in between the major crops that basically act as a soil fertilizer by bringing nitrogen down into the root system, into the soil. Reducing tillage has climate benefits because it's using less fuel and it's disturbing the soil less, so that soil structure is protected and the microbial life in it is not disturbed. Planting all kinds of conservation plantings has a climate benefit. These are things like you might see along roadways or rivers or field edges, these perennial crop plants. They're seldom crops. They're seldom, something that the farmer makes money on directly, but these create habitat and pollinator habitat, and they sequester carbon in their plant mass and in the soil. And these have just many benefits for birds and insects and wildlife. Managed grazing, and I know that Cindy's going to touch on this, has done well. Grazing can actually restore the health of soil and the native habitat, native grass species on a given ranch. Reducing fertilizer inputs is another eligible practice. I mentioned earlier that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and organic fertilizers can off-gas essentially and become nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And then on rangeland, there are grants for planting natives and other perennials like oak woodlands and so on. And there's all kinds of multiple benefits to these, and it's hard to talk about this with a broad stroke, but many of these practices do yield a whole bunch of other co-benefits, and I've touched on some of them, so I think I'll just keep moving on in the interest of time. I guess I want to hold up one though, which is the resilience piece that we have to be thinking more and more about as the impacts of climate change accelerate so rapidly. Making sure we can continue to produce food and keep our farms and businesses has to be front of mind. And these last few years in Sonoma, Marin, Napa County has been rough in so many ways with the wildfires, for example. So, and further, in the Central Valley, the questions about water availability are top of mind. So we have a lot of work to do collectively to make sure we can continue to produce food in the face of what starts to feel, to me at least at times, like a tipping point that we're at with climate change. So happily, a lot of the practices on this list and in the other programs have the benefit of making our farms and ranchers more nimble, more adaptive, more diverse, so that they can withstand some of, and actually improve soil health, so that we have a lot more fertility, a lot better soil structure, so water can penetrate. There's just a sort of tremendous package of benefits that come along with this. And I think a lot of those benefits have been recognized across the country, and we're seeing many states starting to, or already well on their way to developing similar programs to those that have happened here. This is a little bit out of date, this map. It'll change again in the next legislative year, but you can pop onto that website there at the bottom if you want to see a current snapshot. There's a lot of information on that website about the details on some of these bills. But there are a number of states around the country that have moved forward with developing their own healthy soils programs. They don't all look like this. Some of them are very specific. They're just trying to incentivize cover crop planting. There are a few states that are playing around with tax credits for farmers to incentivize different healthy soils practices. There are some states that are doing climate action plans and integrating agricultural solutions into those. So it's a real mix, but I think what it points to is, and I've seen a big surge in this in the last couple, 3 years, this growing awareness about the importance of these practices and these programs. So this is all that optimism and positivity is in sharp contrast to the funding picture here in California and almost every state around the country right now. That is the result really of the pandemic, that we're seeing these deficit budgets almost everywhere we look. And in California, we began the 2020 fiscal year feeling very positive about the funding that that the governor was proposing and that we were advocating for. And what happened, of course, is there's my cat in the background. I told you we'd get somebody visiting us. What happened with the pandemic is that the state went into into a recession, into a deficit budget, from a big surplus down into a deficit, and we saw a real drop in the available funding from what had been proposed early in the year, to the point where we don't expect really any money in these programs, except for the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, that SALC program at the bottom, that has a continuous appropriation. It gets a percentage of the available funding no matter what. But because the available funding has decreased, it's going to see a big drop. So this is not a good picture going forward. The challenge now is to figure out where is that funding going to come from in the future. And it's interesting because Governor Newsom, not even a month ago, issued an executive order calling for 30% of the state's land and coastal waters to be conserved by the year 2030. So it's, for short, it's the 30 by 30 executive order. The problem with this order is that there's no money, to implement it. And number 3 on this list shows that, right in the order, he basically told his secretaries of the relevant agencies that they needed to take action immediately within their existing budgets and their existing authorities. So it doesn't apply any new resources to the effort in the near term. Now, we've got till 2030, and that's not that far away, but it's hopefully we'll be climbing out of this recession fairly quickly and can catch up. The third point, the second point on this list of this executive order would be to establish a biodiversity collaboration, which is a really exciting new way to think about the importance of and the opportunities in working lands. It doesn't apply just to working lands. This executive order applies to all natural and working lands and are within 3 miles of the ocean as well. So it's an encouraging sign from the governor that he sees this as a priority, and it's something that we and other advocates are going to definitely be building on and working with the agencies and with the governor's office and with the legislature going forward to try to realize try to meet this mandate and make it real. I think I'm almost wrapped up here. I think I just want to scale back out to the systems kind of thinking around all this stuff. And we at CalCAN and a lot of the folks that we work with are trying to connect a lot of dots here and figure out a way forward in a very challenging time as we recover from a pandemic, as we grapple with the impacts of a lot of environmental issues on human health, as we look for both opportunities and threats that are coming with regard to climate change, as we think about the fragilities of our food system that were revealed during the pandemic, the sort of heavily specialized and vertically integrated and fairly rigid food system that we have broke down. A lot of people went hungry while a lot of farmers had food they couldn't sell because of the way we've structured our whole food supply. And then I really want to make sure we don't forget the imperative. We think about this a lot as a predominantly white organization and a white coalition of our responsibility in being better and better anti-racist, and really thinking about how every policy that we advance also addresses racism, systemic racism, also does more than just strive for equality, but really make sure that those who have been systemically disenfranchised are prioritized, put to the front of the line with these grant programs, with the technical assistance. And this is becoming more and more central to our thinking and our priorities. And the last thing I'll do before I wrap up is just to sort of appeal to you all to get involved in whatever way you possibly can. This is a team game. CalCAN is a small organization. We would not have achieved what we have without a tremendous amount of partnerships and mentors and advisors. And this is just a snapshot of a couple of letters that we submitted back in the spring, just kind of give you a little bit of a visual of the range of the different organizations that we've worked with in different sectors, different businesses, public health advocates. Even amidst the pandemic, we had some public health organizations step up and sign on to a letter urging the state to invest more in agriculture's climate solutions. And we need to really broaden this. We need to put a lot more logos on this page. And it's not just organizations, it's also individuals. So it's farmers who are modeling the best possible ways to approach food production are, as I said at the beginning, they're really the core of what we do. So in terms of not knowing what the 100 or two of you on the line are interested in, or where your skills lie, I'll just make a general appeal to get involved anywhere you can in this issue. There's CalCAN's by far not the only organization working on this stuff. So, find a group that you feel, and Marin has, lots of options in this regard, but find an organization who works, this is my appeal to you around policy. Get involved with an organization that already does policy work. You don't have to go it alone. There's a lot of groups that do this full time and that need your support in any way, whether it's financial, time, expertise, spreading the word. With the Biden administration, we're going to see some movement for the first time in a decade at the federal level on climate policy, and that will include an agriculture platform, and Biden's already got that put together. So though the outcome of the Georgia Senate race will be determinative in terms of how much legislation is going to actually be able to progress, there is no question that the barriers that existed for the past, since 2009, are going to be a little lower in the near future. So there's lots of opportunity to get involved at the federal level. So ways you can do that are to speak directly to your local, state, or federal elected representatives, speaking from your expertise, bringing forward your values and your priorities, whether it's alone or through another organization. To the extent you are a business person or have employees, making that economic recovery case is going to be a key frame for the foreseeable future, because that's what we're all going to have to be thinking about as we come out of this pandemic. And there's all kinds of ways to raise your voice, whether it's through silent letters and petitions, or making calls, donating, writing letters to the editor. That gets paid attention to by your elected officials. So I think that's all I had to say for now. There's our contact information. I guess actually I should have, we don't answer that phone currently. We're not in the office, but I will get the message if you want to give a call or drop me an email. And I look forward to hearing what Cindy and Jeff have to say, and to any questions at the end. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much. So I really appreciate your summary of how the state of California is helping them move towards more organic and regenerative practices. And also, I really appreciate your calling attention to the fact that the pandemic has slashed budgets that were, often allocated towards environmental goals. A lot of people have said to me, well, with the pandemic and nobody driving, climate crisis is pretty much solved, right? You climate people must be happy. Well, a lot of great programs have suffered from lack of funding and are likely to do so in the future. So it's not quite so simple, and I appreciate you pointing that out. So before we move on to our next speaker, I'd like to give you guys the opportunity to take a quick poll. So here's a question. If you're looking at a sample of rich garden soil with 1 billion bacteria, with several yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, and scores of nematodes, are you looking at a cubic yard of soil, a cupful of soil, or a teaspoon of soil? If you could enter your answer, we will compile them. And meanwhile, I am going to help us answer that question, we're going to be speaking to Dr. Cynthia Daly, a professor within the College of Agriculture at California State University, Chico. She also serves as a Rollins Endowed Professor for Environmental Literacy and the Director for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems. So Cindy's family has actually been in farming for more than 4 generations, and the combination of that experience plus her academic training is what inspired her to create the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems. This center brings together faculty and farmers who recognize the ecological benefits of regenerative farming practices. So Cindy, thank you for speaking with us tonight. Let's pause for a second to check in with Tamala on the results of that poll.
Very good.
Okay, Cindy, can you see the results? How did we do?
Excellent. Hey, it's a sharp crowd. I'm going to have to up my game. This looks great. Well, very good. It is. It's a teaspoon of soil. Amazingly rich in microorganisms and a whole diverse array of different life forms. So it is pretty exciting. It's a very exciting field. And I want to thank Anne Christine and the rest of the staff with the Environmental Forum of Marin. This is an exciting opportunity for me to come and share some of the work that we're doing on a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. And as always, it's great to hear what's going on with Renata and CalCAN. That's an outstanding organization. And I'm looking forward to listening to Jeff here when I wrap this up. And hopefully I can stay on time. It appears that everybody else is. So the bar has been set. Okay, so I'm hoping that my slides look okay, Anne. I'm good. All right.
Yes, all good.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, the topic that I was asked to speak on this evening is on regenerative agriculture, and we're going to talk about alternative approaches to the food and fiber system. And this happens to be one definition, a definition that I really like, and I'm sure you've probably even encountered others. Regenerative agriculture describes farming and grazing practices that, among other things, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. That's a pretty all-encompassing definition, and so I think it's one that I'm going to stick with. You know, clearly it's a big shift in our paradigm in production agriculture. For those of you, of you that have been born and raised in agriculture, the scenario on the left is the common approach where, you know, bare soil, we work that soil. And frankly, there's a lot of farmers that I know that actually are guilty of recreational tillage because, face it, they love driving those tractors. I mean, what's not to love about all that horsepower? And essentially, the soil gets overworked. And every time that soil gets turned and disturbed, we're releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So these two paradigms couldn't be more different. The regenerative side works more with nature, protects the soil, adds biological diversity on the soil and in the soil. It's a more holistic, system-based approach, you know, than the alternative. And clearly there are some stark contrasts in terms of the outcome between you know, that full tillage approach where we're going to beat it into submission and the regenerative approach where we're really trying to take care of the soil. Soil health, soil fertility is really one of the key outcomes of the 5 core principles of regenerative agriculture. You know, minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, keep that soil covered, maintain a living root, and then integrate livestock. We shouldn't be afraid of moving livestock in and out of these systems in a managed sort of system. And the outcome is pretty interesting. We're looking at soil health, we're looking at biodiversity and improving biodiversity and promoting economic resilience in our farming communities. I don't have to tell you what's happened in our farming communities as we've really worked on monoculture and trying to become, you know, these, you know, specialists in corn production and get big or get out. It's been devastating to a lot of the farming communities that I grew up in. I don't even recognize Sublette, Illinois anymore. It's problematic. And clearly, you know, we've got these issues that are also associated with this, you know, the conventional approach, and half the fertilizer that we're utilizing is not really going toward the plant production at all. And I think if more farmers were really aware of that statistic, you know, it would really help us, I think, shift paradigm, because they don't want to throw money away either. When half of it is either going up into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, or going and leaching into the groundwater and surface water as nitrate nitrogen, you know, it's a problem. It's a serious problem. We have more than 405 dead zones that occupy coastal waters. That's 95,000 square miles of dead zone, because the nutrients that we're trying to feed our plants are washing off into our waterways and finding their way into the ocean areas where, you know, they create this algae bloom, and that algae just sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and the result is a dead zone. Nothing can live in that zone. Aquifer contamination, serious problem, clearly in the Central Valley, but really throughout the country and around the globe. And it's not just the nitrate that's in the water causing blue baby syndrome, but it's also the fact that there's a new study coming out that's showing that uranium is also leaching together with the nitrate. So I can't, the effect on bones and kidney is serious and significant. Wow, beating our soil into submission has caused a significant decline in soil health. We're losing quite a bit of topsoil every year. Annual cost is astronomical when you look at the loss in overall productivity. So when people say, well, why are you using this regenerative term? It's because sustainable ag has been around a long time. It's not moved us in the right direction. And clearly, we don't want to sustain this degraded system. And we have a degraded system. We absolutely have to regenerate our ag systems. So, for people like me who were born and raised in agriculture, we were cultured in tillage, full tillage. We were cultured in monocropping. I grew up in that era where we were pulling fences out because we were getting rid of our livestock. That was no longer profitable to be running livestock. And for years, we had always run cattle on top of our corn stubble. And so, this paradigm shift has been something that's been instilled in several generations. We need to unlearn it. And we need to start thinking new thoughts. This is a beautiful orchard in April. This is what we should view as a beautiful thing. Most farmers that I know would look at that and say that's a weed-infested mess. But the fact of the matter is that the paradigm that we need to be considering is that this is diverse, this is very alive, it's resilient, it's going to hold more water, it's going to make us a lot more water efficient, nutrient dense. The side on the left, which many farmers would look at as well manicured, well managed, well, that's really not at all what that is. That's bare naked, dead, thirsty, and sterile. So we have to change the way we think about farming. And that's not going to be easy. We're going to have to unlearn what we learned. Same thing with tillage. The no-till system on the right is really the direction that we need to go. We need to start thinking about that as a thing of beauty. And what's going on the left should be looked at as abuse. We're abusing the soil on that left side. So, the two sides of this production system couldn't be more different. We have high input, we have very manipulate, very reductionist, input consciousness, more geochemical. And on the right, we have more of a biodiverse, we have a very closed system where this stuff just self-regenerates. That's the system we need to strive for. The benefits have been established. From a scientific perspective, I mean, there's plenty of data to tell us that, this is the direction that we need to go. On a relative importance, significantly less global warming with the regenerative farming systems, less pesticide risk, less phosphorus runoff, less nitrate leaching, more soil conservation, more soil organic matter. It basically undoes all the issues that we currently have today. And I love this slide for a couple of reasons. It was a slide that was prepared by Dr. Johnson at New Mexico State University to reflect Gabe Brown's soil carbon data over time. But the other thing that it does, it really reflects Gabe's learning curve. It's his aha moments over time. He started out, he stuck his toe in the water with no-till, and as he tells the story, it's because economically he had to. So he went into a no-till system, got into more of a crop diversity, crop rotation, cover crops. He really got serious about his cover crops, and he went from a 1% soil organic matter up to a 3%. And at this point in time, Gabe is now storing another 45,000 gallons of water per acre on his farm. He's improved his water infiltration rate, so the rainfall that he does receive, he maintains, and the soil will basically absorb it. Whereas his neighbors, he gets a lot of his neighbors' topsoil, which I'm sure he appreciates. And an interesting phenomenon occurred at 3% soil organic matter, and that's where he really had, he could stop fertilizing his crops because at that stage of the game, we have an interesting synergism that takes place. And Gabe is a very mature regenerative system. He stacks practices. He's a no-till guru, multi-species cover crops. He really understands and designs cover crops for any particular situation, any soil type, any cropping system. He does crop rotation, compost application, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and obviously he's very much into diversity. And what happens is that he creates this great diversity on his farms, and it creates great diversity in the soil. So that creates what is now being termed quorum sensing, where the bacterial organisms are now collaborating and communicating, and there is this quorum sensing. I liken it to an orchestra, where you have a full orchestra when they're really going. It's that contrast to a string quartet. When you have that full diversity, they're able to communicate and to synergize in a way that they couldn't if it were half that particular diversity. They do tend to regulate plant photosynthesis and genetic expression in the plants. We're also finding that when we do get this quorum sensing, when we do get this rich diversity that takes place, when we've got a very mature regenerative system, we have a lot of free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Now, originally, we knew a lot about the symbiotic organisms in legumes that would actually fix nitrogen for us. But what we didn't realize is that we had a lot of free-living organisms that will fix nitrogen as well if we just stop killing them. And the way to kill them, obviously, is with tillage and with inorganic fertilizers. And there are some herbicides, pesticides that actually are detrimental to these free-living nitrogen-fixing organisms. So by adding nitrogen into the system, we were inhibiting nature's ability to fix nitrogen in itself. So, here we are. We really need to mirror and mimic nature. Some of these fungal species, we're also learning that they actually just cohabitate. They actually make themselves a part of the plant itself in the root tip. They integrate in there, and they actually start changing metabolic rates and change, the overall activity that's taking place there in the plant itself. So it is truly a symbiotic type relationship. In addition, we're seeing that where the mycorrhizae fungi that are producing this glomalin substance, which is really the basis, the foundation for carbon sequestration. It's this marvelous glue that kind of holds the soil together. And so when you do a slake test for folks in a very mature regenerative ag system, you can see how that would stay together. The glomalin holds that soil in a structure that is very, very stable. So it's less prone to erosion and to leaching and a whole host of other things that it just makes it amazing. And it's easy enough to detect. It is easy enough to detect. Any regenerative farmer that I know is packing a shovel at all times, and they're more than happy to turn their soil over so that they can show anybody who's willing to listen. This is a beautiful aggregate filled with biology. That's your proof right there. That's your legacy that you're leaving in the soil for the next generation. Now, the work that we do at the center is in collaboration with many partners, one of which is Dr. David Johnson and his wife, Wei Chen. They're the founders of this new biologically enhanced management system called BEAM, and it is a static state compost that they produce. It's basically an inoculum filled with very, very diverse microorganisms. They've done the metagenomic work on this compost, and there's 2,600 different species. And what makes it special is that it has a 5-to-1 fungal to bacterial ratio. So it's very rich in fungal species. And I'm not talking any one of this or that. So this is not a bug in the jug talk. This is about diversity. This is about creating quorum sensing. And, this could be in your backyard. And this could be in, the 5,000 or 6,000 acres that you're farming. You build it and they come. This happens to be some hot data right off the presses. This is a study that we're conducting in Wilcox, Arizona, in a conventional corn bean rotation, where we're looking at this biological diversity as a replacement for nitrogen fertilizer. So here we have a conventional corn system, and the second treatment is where we're using this really rich biological inoculum with 15% of the fertilizer that they used in the conventional system. And then the third treatment is beam alone without any fertilizer at all. And then what we're doing, it's a replicated study, and we're looking at the yield in these 3 different treatment groups. And obviously, what we see here is that there was 256 units of nitrogen applied here. In this treatment 2, it was only 38 pounds. And in the third treatment, there was no fertilizer applied at all. So ultimately, when you look at the amount of nitrogen that was removed in the crop and the amount of nitrogen that was left in the soil as a reserve, we can see that in this system lost 126 units of nitrogen, just as the literature would say it should, that we're losing half of the fertilizer that we're applying. When the farmer that is our co-investigator on this study saw this, he the light went off. Why am I applying fertilizer? And then when you look at the economics, I mean, that's when, from a yield perspective, we were down on yields, but ultimately because we don't have the input costs, the revenue is higher on a per acre basis. The beam plus 15 was the highest return per acre, and it was very comparable in overall yield. Now, I think it'll be interesting to see what year 2 and what year 3 brings, because, I think this 15% was basically a Band-Aid that kind of held us over there. And hopefully we can rebuild those soils over time. But what we concluded from that first year, and we've got a lot more to learn, we're also in alfalfa down in Blythe, we're in cotton in down at the Bowles farm in Los Banos, yes. And we're in 6 different sites on rangeland, looking at trying to rebuild some of that soil. I don't know if you're familiar with soil carbon on rangeland, but it's pretty dismal. So we're looking at all these different systems to see what happens when we re-enliven that soil together with a living root. And what we did see is that we're seeing that we can negate the fertilizer inputs, but it's the kind of thing, it's a drug addiction, and it's going to take time to get over that addiction. It does improve biological diversity, it improves water holding capacity and net return per acre. But again, we've got a lot more to learn. And the question that I get a lot, and what the organizers of this event really wanted me to focus in on, is, how does regenerative equate to organic? Now, I've been involved in organic since 2006, when we transitioned the dairy at the university farm to organic. So I'm a big proponent, I'm a big fan, but organic's been around a long time. I think, you could, back at Sir Albert Howard, back in the 40s, we had it's not the kind of thing that has really taken off in production agriculture. We've got 9 million acres to transition, and I think 1% of our farming community is actually registered or certified as organic. So it's not the kind of thing that I don't know that we need to be organic before we go to regenerative. I think regenerative is kind of a gateway drug into organic. So we really need to get this out into the production world in a way that farmers are willing to embrace. I think that's the important piece. We need farmers to really embrace this technology, and they're going to try it a little bit at a time, and they really want to talk to other farmers about how this works. We've been working on building these networks throughout the center. together with partners through UC Cooperative Extension and through other NGOs, trying to identify mentor farmers who can really speak the language with other farmers. And that makes a huge difference. It's, you know, it's cultural. We are the culture in agriculture. And I think that, you know, that's the kind of an approach that's really going to help. Creating these demonstration farms, creating these places where farmers can come and speak with other farmers and kick the tires, I think is really, really critical. The work that we do at the center is all about that, trying to support that kind of a network among the farming community. We've got 10 projects going on currently. 2 of them are research projects of local farmers that have come back for a master's degree in regenerative agriculture. So that's been fascinating for us. We are working on an online master's because we get a lot of interest in that. We have a professional course series that's currently underway. We're beta testing one course this fall. We'll have another one available in the spring. And we continue to work on our outreach and educational programs like so many others on this program tonight. But we're particularly interested in continuing to develop this farmer-to-farmer transition program and to develop a technical service provider training program so that we can put more boots on the ground in all of the RCDs, the resource conservation districts, and other places. PCAs and CCAs, they need to really understand this regenerative model, this systems-based thinking in production agriculture to really move this thing forward in a big way. And we need to do it now. We need to do it fast. So I'm going to close there, and I just want to thank everyone for giving me the time this evening to talk about regenerative agriculture. And I'll be around. I'm really excited to hear what Jeff has to say about what Carbon Cycle Institute has been up to, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to my hosts.
Well, thank you for that, Cindy. I found it fascinating because I've often thought, you know, we hear about soil science and then we also hear, but most farmers don't know about that, or they don't care about that, or it doesn't really interest them as much. And I love how your center is really bringing them together with soil scientists and training really the next generation of farmers who are going to lead on this. And like you say, it can't happen too quickly for our good. That was awesome. Thank you so much. So we've got another poll question for our audience to consider before our next speaker comes on. So here it is. On a global scale, which of these 3 has the greatest capacity to absorb carbon? Is it plants? Is it the atmosphere? Is it soil? And while you ponder that, I'd like to tell you a bit about our final speaker, Jeffrey Creek, a co-founder of the Marine Carbon Project and director of Rangeland and Agro-Ecosystem Management at the Carbon Cycle Institute. Jeff has more than 35 years of experience in organic agriculture, rangeland management, and watershed restoration, much of it here in Marin. In fact, if you've ever used compost from the Bolinas Stinson Beach Resource Recovery Compost or West Marin Compost, you can thank Jeff because he helped start both these projects and continues to consult with them. So it looks like we're getting the results in from that poll, and I think everybody's assuming it since this is about soils. The answer is going to be soil. But let's see. Jeff, what do you think? Thank you for joining us tonight. And it looks like most of our participants are thinking it's a soil. Can you let us know if they're right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. And I think after listening to Cindy's talk, I'd be surprised if folks hadn't picked that up. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see.
Maybe you could tell them by how much more soil it has, you know.
Soil is the
relatively speaking, I think
is the basically the 3rd largest carbon pool on the planet. It currently holds about anywhere between 2,500 and 4,000 gigatons of carbon. And I'll actually bring up a slide in a bit to talk about that. Can you see that okay?
Yep, I can see your slides and hear you perfectly. So
okay,
take it away.
Great. So I'm going to share some of the work of the Carbon Cycle Institute, but really much of this work stems out of the work of the Marine Carbon Project, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. Going back to about 2006, when a group of us in Marin County really got interested and concerned about the role of agriculture in climate change, and really wanted to dive into the potential for agriculture to be part of this climate solution. We've been sort of dancing around the question of the carbon cycle all evening. I thought it'd be helpful just to look at this real quickly. Carbon cycle is this massive movement of carbon that happens at the planetary scale on Earth, upon which all life depends. Interesting thing about carbon is it occurs in 5 major pools. And as it moves between those pools, which it does as a cycle, it changes form. And so, of course, we're all familiar with and focused on the fossil pool, coal, oil, gas, etc. And that's because we're busily burning it up as fast as we can. And when we oxidize carbon from the fossil pool, of course, we produce carbon dioxide. And so we have these growing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ocean, which is actually the largest carbon pool on the planet, has done a wonderful job of absorbing much of that extra CO2. But in doing so, we've seen our oceans acidifying, because as carbon enters the ocean, it becomes carbonic acid. And consequently, we have a warming, rising, acidifying ocean. A lot of folks have looked to vegetation, specifically to trees, as a potential place to park our extra carbon dioxide. Trees do, in fact, absorb a lot of CO2, and they're great. We should all be planting trees where appropriate. But as all of us living in the West are well aware, trees have a nasty habit of returning their carbon to the atmosphere in rather catastrophic ways. Soil, then, is as I said, the 3rd largest pool on the planet. And the beauty of soils, of course, is that as we increase the carbon content of our soils, as Cindy so beautifully pointed out, good things start to happen. And so we really are looking at soil as the logical place to be parking this surplus CO2. It makes a lot of sense because much in the atmosphere, in fact, originates in the soils. About 1/3 of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a result of the way we've treated our landscapes and our soils, particularly over the last 250 years or so. This figure sort of illustrates that. Let's see if I can get this out of the way. What you see here is rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. This is informed by the black line here is the Keeling curve, an actual record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere taken from the top of the Mauna Loa volcano. But we also have ice core records that allow us to go back in time. And so starting around the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we see this steady increase in carbon, and then post-World War II, this rapid rise as we really ramped up our use of fossil fuels. But a parallel phenomenon is this increasing loss of soil carbon. So again, a paper by Sanderman et al. From a couple of years ago showing the loss of carbon from our rangeland and cropland soils, which parallels this increase in atmospheric carbon. It's not the only driver, but it's a significant contributor. The consequence, of course, is global soil degradation. Cindy also touched on this, but essentially anywhere human beings are engaged in agriculture, we're seeing significant degradation of our soils. So much so that at this point, in 2015, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations suggested that we have 60 harvests left. Well, that leaves us 55 more to go. So it's not an encouraging picture right now. I think anybody who's had a chance to drive through the Central Valley recently may wonder whether they're looking at Oklahoma in 1935 or California in 2035. At the rate we're going with the climate change impacts that Renata mentioned, and the issues that Cindy touched on, there is not a lot of good news around in agriculture in California. But it begs the question, what are we really talking about when we talk about managing for carbon? What we're really talking about here is the movement of solar energy, the transformation of solar energy, if you will, into biochemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. Now, this is a pretty phenomenal thing to think about. It's pretty miraculous. So plants, using solar energy, capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transform it into simple and complex sugars. And then those sugars and carbohydrates are then available to the entire food web, starting, of course, with soil biology, as Cindy so beautifully pointed out. And then that energy can cascade throughout the food web. So all we're really talking about here is managing the flow of solar energy into our farming systems, and then hopefully retaining that energy in the system as long as we can, as well as, of course, transforming it into the products of agriculture. So when we talk about managing for carbon, we're really talking about having our hands on the most powerful lever we could possibly have our hand on to drive the dynamics of our farming systems. Just quickly dip into this concept of positive feedbacks because it pertains directly to the question of regenerative agriculture. A positive feedback is a system change, that results in a deviation amplifying process that drives directional system change. And the example here is at the global scale. So we can look at Arctic sea ice in 1979 and Arctic sea ice now. And what we see is that as Arctic ice has melted due to global warming, we've had dark water exposed at the North Pole. That dark water, of course, can absorb solar radiation more efficiently than can the reflective ice. And so the water warms more quickly, melting more ice, exposing more dark water, etc. So a very good example of a positive feedback process at the global scale. When we look at the history of climate change, if you will, we have been living in a really quite an equilibrial system for a very long time. This is 800,000 years of ice core records showing that, yes, CO2 does fluctuate over time, but it fluctuates within a certain range from which it really hasn't deviated for about 3 million years. And that's between 190 and 290 parts per million. But this is where we are today. We're sitting at, as of yesterday, 412 parts per million. So something clearly has happened. We are entering an entirely different system state. And since we evolved as a species within this situation, it's very unlikely that we're going to thrive under these new conditions. So what do we do about it? Well, we're not going to reverse climate change by eliminating emissions alone, and Renata pointed this out. We have to withdraw large quantity of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we need to do it for a sustained period of time. And at this point, enhancing soil carbon is the only viable option for achieving what we might call negative emissions. Just to reiterate this point, this is where we could be with reduced emissions. If we were to continue our current emission rates, we would find ourselves at about 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which has been generally recognized as a completely unacceptable state of affairs. If we were to reduce emissions by 6% annually, starting now, we could in fact bring our CO2 levels down to sort of the upper end of the Holocene maximum, sort of where we might consider to be normal range, the very upper end of the normal range. And a year ago, I would have said that reducing emissions by 6% would be impossible, but actually with the onset of COVID, we saw emission reductions of about 7% globally. So we know we can do this, but of course it may take something on the order of a pandemic to make it happen. On the other hand, if we engage emission drawdown, carbon dioxide drawdown and emission reductions, you could bring our temperatures down really to what we might consider normal range before the end of the century. And that's a very hopeful proposition. So returning then to the work of the Marine Carbon Project, when we came together in 2006 around this question of what could agriculture do, we had a conversation with Dr. Wendy Silver at UC Berkeley, a biogeochemist who'd done quite a bit of work with tropical soils. And we asked this question: could we sequester carbon in marine soils? And so we formulated a very simple hypothesis that in fact we could increase soil carbon through some agricultural management practice, and that we would be able to measure that increase. We knew that if we couldn't measure it, we wouldn't have much of a story to tell. And so with Dr. Wendy Silver's engagement, she immediately put her graduate student, Becca Rouse, who's now Dr. Becca Rouse working at UC Merced, we set about testing this, again, very simple hypothesis. And how do we do that? We decided to add some carbon to the system and then just come back and see if we could measure it. That was sort of the basic idea. And so to add some carbon to these grazed grassland systems in Marin County, we simply put some compost out on the surface of that vegetation. We decided to put out 1/2 inch because we thought that was about as much as we could put out without burying the grass. And we knew if we buried the grass, we wouldn't get a whole lot of photosynthetic capture of carbon. So this is 1/2 inch of compost going out. This is actually at the Yuba County Research Station, Sierra Foothill Research Station up in the foothills. But we did a similar process in the Marin County site in the Casio at the Wick Rathman Ranch. I'm not going to give you all the data because that would take too much time, but I do want to share this summary slide because it pertains to this question of positive feedbacks. What I'm showing you here is this hockey stick curve is the carbon, the compost carbon going onto the system in year 1. And then we have a rather precipitous decline in that carbon as that compost decays and returns much of that carbon returning to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But as steep as this curve is, you can see it actually lasts for several decades, which was much longer than we'd anticipated. I think we thought we would see most of that carbon gone within the first year or two. After the first year, we still had 96% of that compost carbon in the system. What we hadn't anticipated, because we hadn't been thinking in the system's context, was the system response to that big slug of solar energy or carbon going into the system in year 1. What happened was that we had enhanced plant growth on the treated plots. Well, what does that mean when we say we had enhanced plant growth? It means we had enhanced drawdown of carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis. And some of that carbon, newly drawn down, ended up in the soil system, helping to support increased water holding capacity in the soil and improving the fertility of the soil so that in the next year, we again saw an increase in photosynthetic capture of carbon through enhanced plant growth. Now the model is telling us that this enhancement of photosynthetic capture of carbon and storage of carbon in the ecosystem will continue for several decades. All of this in response to a single slug of carbon or solar energy being captured or being applied to the system in the first year. And even 100 years out, we've got more carbon in the system than we started with. What this tells us is that we can, in fact, initiate a positive feedback process, a deviation amplifying system process, driving the system in exactly the direction we want it to go. In other words, we can take this unintentional anthropogenic forcing of atmospheric carbon and actually counteract it with an intentional anthropogenic forcing of soil organic carbon. Now, to do that, we have to act at the global scale, clearly. But what we're talking about here, this is the intra-annual flux of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's what these squiggly lines on the Keeling curve are all about. Every year, we see about 6 parts per million drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere as our northern hemisphere forests and our northern Pacific phytoplankton leaf out, and they suck down huge quantities of carbon dioxide. But then come fall and winter, most of that carbon dioxide, of course, returns to the atmosphere through decay, death, decay, and decomposition. But if we could hold on to a little more of that carbon each year, and retain a little bit more of it, and draw down a little more of it each spring and summer, we could indeed bend the curve in the direction we need to go. And I've thrown this 500 parts per million up here because even though I've already shown you a slide saying we have 412 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, when we add in the nitrous oxide and the methane that we've emitted, we are actually sitting at about 500 parts per million in this annual greenhouse gas index that NASA puts out every year. So information brought us to a place we call carbon farm planning because we recognize that there are many, many ways to increase carbon capture on working lands. We developed the carbon farm planning process directly from the NRCS, or the Soil Conservation Service conservation planning process, but we put carbon at the center of the planning process and use carbon as an organizing principle around which we develop the plan. What we've discovered is that this actually simplifies the planning process, and it also connects on-farm practices directly with ecosystem processes, including energy flow, on-farm water holding capacity, soil health, agricultural resilience, and of course, climate change and climate change resilience. We're able to quantify the benefits of plans, of implementing these plans, using a very simple online tool developed in collaboration with Colorado State University and USDA and the Marine Carbon Project, which allows us to simply input our location and our management practices, and then basically spits out a greenhouse gas value for that. So of the many ways to increase carbon capture, and both Renata and Cindy have touched on these, I'll just share a few. Cover cropping, of course, getting away from bare fallow, which is all too common in California and across the United States. Shelter belts, integrating woody agroforestry species into our cropping systems. Silvopasture, integrating trees into our pasture systems or integrating livestock into our woodland systems. Prescribed grazing, Cindy touched on this, and when I say prescribed grazing, I specifically mean the management of livestock on pasture to increase soil carbon under that grazed sward. Now these changes can happen very quickly. This is a soil from a Mendocino vegetable grower up on the Mendocino coast. This is her soil in year 1 at 1.5% organic matter, and this is 4 years later at 6% organic matter. Achieved primarily with compost applications, but also with cover cropping and avoidance of tillage and integration of livestock into her cropping system. This is another example of a potent carbon capture strategy. This is actually a Marin County ranch, Stemple Creek Ranch. I'm sure many of you know Stemple Creek. This is what Stemple Creek looked like in 1990. And when the RCD and Straw and the Poncha family partnered to begin to restore that riparian system. By 2010, you can see we had a pretty good establishment of willow in the creek. And recently, we've got really good stands of trees, of diverse species in the system. And you can imagine how much carbon is represented by that standing vegetation, but also, of course, in the soil beneath those trees. Interestingly enough, Point Blue has documented over 35 species of migratory birds nesting in this restored habitat. And if you think about it, if you remember that carbon is solar energy, you can imagine how much more energy there is in this system, which is to say how much more energy is available to support that increased biodiversity within this restored system. And that's exactly the opportunity we're speaking of when we talk about regenerative agriculture. So this is showing the actual carbon increases. Wasn't much of an increase in the channel. As you can imagine, with that dynamic movement of water, you don't get accumulation of carbon. But on the floodplain and at the upper bank, you see a very significant increase in carbon in both of those systems. And this is just over a 20-year period. This work of the Marin RCD and the cooperating farmers has resulted in the capture of over 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. All of this allows us really to talk about a climate beneficial agriculture. And here you see Jensen Ranch and Stemple Ranch have partnered with Coyote to develop this line of climate beneficial products, which are being marketed with the climate beneficial story behind them. Similarly, we partnered with Organic Valley a few years back to develop carbon farm plans for 3 Organic Valley dairies in our region. Again, Organic Valley, using that story, the carbon farming story and the climate beneficial agriculture story as a marketing tool to promote their organic dairy products. Finally, although writing carbon farm plans can be interesting, our goal, of course, is not to produce carbon farm plans, it's to produce carbon farmers. And by that, I mean farmers who are fully aware of the role of the carbon cycle in their production systems, who understand the benefits to their farm systems of accruing carbon, capturing more carbon and solar energy in their systems, and are able to tell that story and share the success that they've enjoyed from that understanding with their peers. We're working with we started, of course, with the Marin Resource Conservation District. Nancy Scolari was one of the members of the original Marin Carbon Project group. We're now working with 39 RCDs and partner organizations across. They've written, I should say, with some support from us, about 100 carbon farm plans, with about 58 more in progress right now. We find that demand is far outweighing our capacity to meet that demand. Marin itself has actually 20 completed plans, most of which have some degree of implementation underway, and there are another 20 producers right now waiting for plans within Marin. The RCDs have organized into regions, 7 regional hubs for these 39 RCDs, with the idea that they could share resources and capacity to strengthen their carbon farming programs. To achieve neutrality for California agriculture, if we were to strive for that across the state, we would need to be sequestering about 36 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. And just to kind of put that in context, you do the math on what it means to increase soil organic matter on the state's 20 million acres. That's 334 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So our soils, as I mentioned at the beginning, are huge carbon sinks and are hugely, have huge potential, enormous potential, much more, I think, even the state realizes, to absorb, hold, and benefit from increased carbon content. Locally in Marin County, as you know, a draft climate action plan has just come out, a revised draft. The 2015 plan was just updated. Agriculture is credited with about 9% of the county's emissions. What we saw in the 2015 plan, we had just finished writing our first carbon farm plans, so there were only 3 completed. So we did get carbon farming into that 2015 climate action plan, but it was really just mentioned as a possible future measure. This year with the revision, agriculture and carbon farming are recognized as a primary mitigation strategy, with the goal of drawing down about 82,000 metric tons of CO2 by 2030. And at full build out, that is to say, if we could engage all of Marin's agri, drawing down about 186,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide on an ongoing annual basis. And these are just some of the practices that show up in the carbon farm planning framework. There are several more that are not listed here. Obviously, the good news is that we can transform carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into products of agriculture and soil organic matter and build resilience within our farming systems. So all kinds of good news there. But the other side of this equation, of course, is that we really have to move on this immediately. We're headed toward a 3-degree rise in global temperature by 2100 if we don't take a really drastic and immediate action. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was inspiring to see that there's so much more interest than there, well, inspiring and kind of frustrating that there's so much more interest than there is capacity, but I think that's a great sign that we could be headed towards, a real rethinking of farming and what its main purpose is. Of course, its main purpose will always be to feed us, but if its secondary purpose is to sequester as much carbon as possible, that would be terrific. So thank you so much. I learned a lot from that.
Thank you.
So let's see, next up, we have a question and answer period, which will be moderated by Diana Donlan. We're going to give Diana a few minutes to look through the questions, and while she does that, we're going to show you the trailer for a film that we highly recommend watching. It's called Kiss the Ground. Tamla, can you roll it?
There's so much bad news about our planet, it's overwhelming. Truth is, I've given up. This is the story of a simple solution, a way to heal our planet. The solution is right under our feet, and it's as old as dirt.
All of our soils that are under chemical conventional agriculture are almost completely devoid of microorganisms.
Modern agriculture was not designed for the betterment of the soil. Fossil fuels are by no means the only thing that is causing climate change. When we damage soils, carbon goes back to the atmosphere.
But when we destroy soil, it releases carbon dioxide.
Biosequestration is using plants, trees, and techniques of grazing and farming to capture carbon and store it in the soil.
We can fix a lot of our climate issues if we bring the CO2 down into a living plant and put it back into the soil where it belongs.
Plants working with soil microorganisms, it seems too simple.
Healthy soils lead to a healthy plant, healthy human, healthy climate.
There could be a way to eat food that heals the planet.
The problem isn't the animal. The problem is where the animals are at.
How do we take waste and repurpose and reuse it, because it's really not waste?
The poop has to stay in the loop.
Compost is just one of a suite of soil-based carbon capture solutions.
We know how to do it. And if we continue to scale over 30 years, we can reverse global warming.
We can get the Earth back to the Garden of Eden that it once was by regeneration.
To see biodiversity return to a place that was completely devastated.
That gives me hope.
Our health and the health of our planet are connected.
If you look over here, my neighbor's land that has been chemical fallow, then you look over at our paddocks, you have a diversity of different plant species. Which model do you want your food to be produced from? The answer is pretty simple to me.
I'll make you a deal. I won't give up, and neither should you.
I learned a lot from that film. Actually, I watched it again just last night, and I was struck by one of the things they said, which is that if we implement regenerative agriculture on a broad scale, we could actually see global cooling within a really short period of time. I think they said 20 years. It was very inspiring, so I do hope you'll check it out. So Diana, I'm guessing you're ready now. So I'd like to introduce our moderator, Diana Donlan, who produced the short film you saw at the start of this program for the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. Diana is co-founder and executive director of Soil-Centric, which is a Marin County-based nonprofit designed to accelerate engagement in regenerative agriculture and ecosystem restoration. So if you're wondering what role you can play in solving the climate crisis, Soil-Centric can help you find your own path to participating in a regeneration type project. So be sure to check them out after the webinar at soilcentric.org. So welcome, Diana. Tell us, what questions does our audience have for our panelists this evening?
So Renata, with that idea of Wendell Berry, you mentioned his theory of solving for pattern. Do you have an example where you've seen this in action with some of the farmers that you work with?
Yeah, the first person that came to mind, and there are many stories of this, maybe I can squeeze in two. One is a farmer named Jose Robles down in San Joaquin Valley, small grower, almond production. He lives with his family on the farm. It's not his day job, it's his passion, but he sells or installs doors for a living, which is not an uncommon story. A lot of farmers are doing that. He got some help from one of our advisors, Rex DeFore, at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, in applying for a Healthy Soils grant. This was 3 years ago. And he was able to get funding for cover cropping and compost application. And he had a pretty bad nematode problem, which is a pretty common soil infestation that causes problems with the root growth on the trees. So he was battling that with various chemical inputs. So he put on this cover crop, put on the compost, and within one application or one season, he saw his nematode population drop dramatically, and he was able to stop using the chemical inputs and was just immediately converted to this whole different way of thinking about soil and doing the practices. And he got so excited about it that he's kind of become something of a champion for the programs. He came and spoke at a conference, an annual conference, the EcoFarm conference in Asilomar a year and a half ago. And he came up to Sacramento and testified with us in front of the legislature about the importance of funding these programs. So not only did he have this positive benefit on his farm, but he became a real leader and a champion. And it just was one of the most, most exciting stories that I, or success, sort of almost overnight transitions that I know of.
Okay. This question is for Cindy Daly, and it comes from Elizabeth Pierce, who wants to know, she says, it seems biological farming requires more creativity, awareness, and intuition than conventional farming. And how do you see this evolving? Is it, in your opinion, generational?
I think it is clearly generational. This input consciousness has been passed on now for a couple of generations, really, since the 40s and 50s, where a lot of this, started. So yeah, I think it is. Biological farmers tend to be more connected, I think, to their farming system. They have to start thinking in systems rather than in, I've got this pest, or I'm going to go out and get this spray. So it's not doing the Band-Aid reductionist approach. It's really looking at the full system. Weeds, basically, tell you what's happening in your system, and you manage for what you want, not for what you don't want. So it is a different, it's a whole different approach, and it is generational. And so this is a big undertaking. This is a huge paradigm shift for a lot of folks in agriculture. But I will say that there are a lot of farmers coming into agriculture today that have no ag background. And in many cases, that's not a bad thing, because they don't come with a lot of baggage or biases or that type of thing. So there is that. I think it's an exciting time to be in ag.
Great. So this one I'm going to give to Jeff. An anonymous attendee has asked us, is regenerative farming carbon farming? But not all carbon farming is regenerative farming. Do you understand the question? Shall I read it again? Okay. Is regenerative farming carbon farming? But not all carbon farming is regenerative farming. So I guess the question really is, what's the distinction, Jeff, between carbon farming and regenerative farming?
Yeah, well,
or is there a distinction?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction. And from my perspective, the reason I've settled on carbon as a focal point, I came to this, as you said in your introduction, with 35 years of farming experience. So this was a long evolution for me. Starting as an organic farmer, focused on soil organic matter because that's what the books told me to do. Certainly what Sir Albert Howard had to say, and Rodale, and all the old masters, it was all focused on organic matter. And organic matter ultimately is carbon, and that's what we're talking about. So I can put my hands on carbon. I can move carbon around my farm physically. I can understand the carbon cycle and engage with it proactively. Regenerative is I think a much broader and in many ways a much vaguer term. Where they intersect quite appropriately, I think, is in that systems context I tried to portray in my slides, where regenerative, ultimately, to be regenerative, has to engage processes that, in fact, draw down more carbon from the atmosphere and transform it into soil fertility and the products of agriculture, and builds and initiates a positive feedback process. But that positive feedback process is driven by carbon and the embodied solar energy in that carbon. So they're in many ways they're the same thing, but I prefer myself to use the carbon farming framework because it's very clean, it's very precise, where regenerative can get very fuzzy. And Cindy, I think, does a beautiful job of keeping it grounded and real, but I often find folks use that term without understanding the nexus with actual biophysical processes that drive actual regenerative agriculture. So for me, it's just a more clean and precise term to talk about carbon capture and carbon farming.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer, because I know there's a big debate even within the regenerative movement right now about settling on a definition. And, is is regenerative just organic without the rules. You know, so there's a lot that needs to be clarified. But I think for the purposes of our audience, one way I find really useful to think about regeneration is if you think of the outcomes and the outcomes based, because so many of our models are input based. And if we're measuring for increased water holding capacity or increased biodiversity or increased soil carbon capture, that's all regenerative. We have a number of questions that tend towards home gardening and weeds and so forth, but I'm going to ask one to Cindy that is very precise. Has anyone tried to use native plants as cover crops? By weeds, I mean invasive non-natives, and that comes from Shelley.
Has anybody tried to use natives as a
native plants as cover crops?
Well, I think there's a lot of folks out there trying to use, you know, perennial seeding systems out in rangeland ecosystems. I think that that's a fairly common thing. And, you know, we're playing around with some annuals because we can, but going in with more of a native perennial would be a very interesting approach. And, you know, a lot of the seeding of perennials has not been very successful. I know that the hedgerow farms, there are some people that are making it happen, but it's a difficult push in many respects. And, you know, I think Jeff could probably speak to that. We would love to try, you know, looking at, you know, developing an inoculated perennial grass seeding to see if we couldn't get, you know, a better stand on our native, on our winter rangelands. In particular, that is, you know, because we've lost a lot of our perennials. Although managed grazing has done many things for our system. I have an organically certified grazing business myself, and just by changing the grazing practices into a more of a managed intensive system, I've brought back a lot of perennial systems, which blows my mind that their seed bank can still be in the soil after so many decades. It's mind-blowing. So specifically, I don't know that I could really point my finger to any particular producer who is using perennial cropping systems, you know, as a cover crop. But you know, ultimately, I guess our whole move in a no-till system is to really, you know, get there. So that's you know, that would be the mecca.
That's great. Renata, try this one from Marilyn Farley. Do you have experience with vineyards and how you would apply these principles to them? I know that you've worked with vintners. What are you seeing out there in the vineyards?
There's a big range of approaches. I think at the very least, cover cropping, you know, whether it's alternating you know, alleys or annual cover cropping of the whole vineyard. That's sort of the least, I think, that can be done. There are also vineyards that are doing a pretty good job of integrating wild habitat around the edges or within blocks. And that's a big source of carbon. Fetzer Vineyard years ago did a study of its carbon stocks and didn't look actually at the vines. They just looked at the non-producing areas and had some pretty interesting data that we can look at. I think probably the most, for me at least up here in Sonoma County, one of the leaders in this area is Preston Vineyards, not to do a commercial necessarily, but what's cool about what they're doing is they've actually, they don't call themselves a vineyard anymore. They've so diversified their operation that they're certainly they're growing a lot of grapes and a lot of amazing wine is coming out of there, but they have also started for years now been planting lots of hedgerows, olives, chickens, wheat. They make their own bread. God, Jeff, whatever, they have probably dozens of crops coming off that land right now. I haven't been out there for a couple of years, but I mean, that kind of diversity regardless of whether it's vineyards or any other operation, orchards or or any other, you know, food crop. It just, that to me is Mecca, another Mecca, to really think about agricultural efficiency different than we do right now, which is mainly growing just a handful of things at best.
So you're really talking about diversification and reintegrating animals, and I've seen a lot of groups, a lot of vintners that are bringing sheep onto their lands now to take care of adding the fertility, but also nibble down some of the vegetation in between the vineyard so that it doesn't get too high and so forth. So exactly. There's a lot of really cool innovation happening right now.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the livestock integration. That's a really, really important piece of it too.
Yeah. So Jeff, we have a question from David Rempel, who asks, can you discuss again how many acres in California would have to be treated to balance carbon produced by ag? I think that maybe that refers to the point when you were talking about some of the state, or no, I guess you were talking about the Marin plan. This is—
Well, I talked about ag neutrality. So if ag were going to become neutral in California, ag emissions in California are estimated to be about 36 million metric tons annually. And I think I compared that with the potential to sequester about 10 times that amount of carbon dioxide as soil carbon, just by increasing Central Valley soils or our arable lands in the state by 1%, increasing the soil organic matter content by 1%. So we have many, many years of potential neutrality in ag if we can continue to increase our soil carbon in our arable lands, take it from what's probably now averaging around 1%, maybe 1.5% in the arable soils of the state. If we could take that up to 3, 4, 5, 6%, that's a huge quantity. Every percent representing over 300 million metric tons of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. There's this huge sink, which we're all basically at the state level pretending isn't there, but it is there. The only thing missing is a functional program that would actually take advantage of that opportunity. So I hope that answers the question.
I think that's so hopeful. Really exciting, and we seem to have a governor who's on board. All right, I'm going to give you a follow-up, Jeff, that's a little more difficult. Laura Lovett from the Native Plant Society asks, which types of land are you adding the compost to? Native plants do not want added compost. This causes rapid growth that the plant cannot sustain. So what's your comment? What's your response to Laura?
My response is that carbon farming is happening in the context of whole farm conservation planning. So any decision to use compost or not to use compost is really a decision that gets made by the producer and their technical service provider. So ideally, and my observation universally, a decision to deploy compost as a strategy happens in a very holistic planning context. So I think, the kinds of concerns raised by that question, I think are more or less moot given the way carbon farm planning is being deployed across California.
Great. All right. We have about 4 minutes left, and I think I'd like to ask this question from Ellie Cohen and have everybody answer it. And then if we have time for one more, these are really great questions, you guys. All right, Ellie says, thanks for the fantastic presentations. It is an exciting time to be in agriculture, except we are at the beginning of a severe multi-decade drought in California. How do we scale up the multi-benefit practices fast enough to make a difference in our race against devastating climate changes? So can we do a little round robin, starting with Cindy about scaling these practices fast enough?
Right. Well, I think we've got an interesting combination of people on this panel, and everybody has a role to play. You know, clearly getting these carbon farm plans out onto the landscape in a big, broad way is a great way to hook these producers and engage them in that conversation. The funding that Renata is talking about, you know, it takes the risk out of jumping into that kind of a paradigm. And then, you know, we continue to do some of the applied research and the educational programs and trying to develop farmer-to-farmer transition programs, which many folks have had. It's going to be everybody at the table. We need all hands on deck. I mean, we don't have a lot of time, and everybody needs to continue to doing everything that they can at full speed in order to get the transition to take place. I will say that there does appear to be a model that works well, and that is, you know, trying to meet these farmers where they are, providing them with effective demonstrations where they can actually go see it work in places that are successful, and they need to be talked to in a farmer language that they really understand. You know, it's very difficult, I think, you know, not to have that kind of engaging conversation. They learn so much better from each other. And that's why, you know, elevating the hero farmers that we have, the incredibly dynamic regenerative farmers that have been engaged in this for several decades already. I mean, they've got a history record, and they really are very articulate and great educators. So we need to elevate that and really promote the heck out of it, and all hands on deck. That would be my approach.
Great. We have 1 minute, so I'm going to give 30 seconds to each Renata and Jeff. How do we scale up this fast enough to make a difference? Jeff, you first.
Okay. You know, if we have about 30 million metric tons of organics in California right now that is not being used, we could deploy that to rapidly build soil carbon in our arable lands. That would also alleviate the need for almost all the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that we're currently using in California. So those are two huge opportunities that could, just by tweaking some state policy, could actually be brought to bear very quickly, I think. And hopefully then producers would have the opportunity to see the impact of increasing the carbon content of their soils, which would hopefully then drive adoption of further practices. So again, deploying all of that through the existing RCD network is sort of the model that we're working with.
And Renata, you have the final word here.
Yeah, similar threads, sort of Marshall Plan scale investment of public funding. I mean, and it's got to be at the federal level. I mean, it's great. California's done an amazing job, but states can't spend more than they bring in. And so this really has to be done at the federal level. We need to pump a tremendous amount of money into all the things that we've been talking about tonight, and things like an AmeriCorps type approach, you know, sort of look at the Dust Bowl, look at the moonshot, whatever grand metaphor you want to bring to bear. That's the scale of the investments we need, and they really have to be public investments. They have to be democratically controlled and deployed through our public schools, our public research institutions, and our farmers and ranchers.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Anne-Christine, but thank you, panelists. It's great. And thank you, participants, for these amazing questions. If we didn't get to your question, we will try to match your question up with the speakers and see if they can provide an answer that's satisfactory to you. And sorry about my mouse not working. I even got my haircut for the event for the first time since March, so I'm sorry you can't see my short haircut, but oh well. Anne-Christine.
Clearly it was a haircut that jinxed it. I think that's where you went wrong. But yes, those were great questions and answers, and thank you so much for your work in moderating those, Diana. That was very helpful. I am sorry we don't have time to address everything tonight, but as Diana was saying, we're going to see if we can get answers to some of those questions and send a follow-up email to try to answer as much as possible. But for now, to respect everybody's time, we need to say goodnight. And so on behalf of the Environmental Forum of Marin, I would like to thank first our speakers and moderator for being so generous with their time and expertise and commitment to environmental education. It's a great gift you've given us all this evening. And thank everyone present for being a great audience and for showing up on a Tuesday night. I would like to encourage you all to take action on the important issues raised this evening. In addition to the suggestions made by our speakers during the program, our sponsors have also suggested some actions you can take with them, and we'll be sharing this list with you in a follow-up email. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, Strauss, Malt, AIM, 350 Marin, Drawdown Marin, OFA, and the Sierra Club Marin chapter. So thanks again, everyone, and good night. Take care out there.